Welcome to DeviceTalks West. We're so excited that you're here. We're going to kick off this morning with an opening keynote from Reggie Groves. She's the CEO of Reva Medical. Yeah, thanks for being here. Let's get started. Sure. Reggie, first of all, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
I'm wondering, you've had a really interesting career in medical devices. Can you tell us a little bit about your first job in Medtech?
Sure. My first medical device job was at Medtronic in 2002. My career prior to that was in strategy consulting. I was CFO at a children's hospital. I did CFO of a payer provider. I did an internet IT company. And Medtronic was getting ready to launch the very first remote device check business called CareLink, that the patient could have a box in the home that talked to their implanted device. And so their job description for the general manager of that business was, we want you to have every experience there is, strategy, finance, payer, provider, but no medical device experience. And it sort of fit my background, and I joined Medtronic.
So what did you know about Medtronic at the time?
Not a whole lot. I knew they were a big medical device company. They'd, in the news a lot in the late 90s with, acquisitions and the stock splitting and that kind of stuff. But I didn't really know very much about it. I didn't know very much about medical devices, to be honest.
So you come in to Medtronic. It's your job to launch the CareLink business. Can you tell us a little bit about that process?
Sure. So remember, we had the craze of the internet in the late 90s, and it was just beginning to crash. But the concept was to go direct to the patient with this capability and to link the patient to the physician and try to create a new business model was the initial, which is why they didn't want somebody with medical device experience, because they didn't want the business model polluted with knowledge from the space. So I came in to launch, which was going to be the physicians paying a fee for having access to be able to see the patient's medical information remotely. We talked about this before. The key that really got me to decide to join Medtronic and to do this was, while I was in the interview process, the first Medicare region approved reimbursement for the physician to do the device check as if the patient was in the office, but the patient was at home. So I knew then that if a physician could be paid to manage the patient at home, that we had something that was going to work. And so I came in to get that off the ground and then meet all the challenges that come with trying to do something disruptive.
And we're definitely going to get into that. I want to talk about another role that you had at Medtronic, which was in the regulatory and quality space. Can you talk to us a little bit about how that opportunity arose for you?
Sure. So I was running CareLink. The short version is the business model got disrupted and everything changed, and they didn't want a general manager anymore. And at the time, the mid-2005-06 timeframe, Medtronic had a recall of an implanted device. Guidant had a recall or two and was getting ready to have more. And so quality became a really traumatic time for the industry. And my boss wanted somebody running quality that he thought could bring new life, new talent, and really raise the bar on quality. He gave me regulatory along the way. So he said, here, why don't you do this instead? And I said, okay.
Yeah, so I think the recall that you're talking about is the Fidelis lead recall.
Right.
I'm sure many of us in here are familiar with that time in industry. Walk us through what that experience was like for you.
Yeah, so I actually, when I started in quality, Fidelis wasn't recalled. We were in the very early stages of the Fidelis life and death. So Fidelis was the world's most popular lead. There were something like 160 or 180,000 patients just in the US alone with that lead. It's a defibrillator lead. For anybody who doesn't know what a defibrillator lead is, you got the can implanted, the lead in the heart, and it delivers the shock to get you out of sudden cardiac death. It was in so many patients that even a very, very low rate of failure was pretty visible. And the way that Fidelis failed was more visible because it tended to just deliver shocks, even though you didn't need it. And they hurt and they're very visible. So we did the investigation. We invented all sorts of novel ways to try to figure out, is this lead problematic or not? Because the failure rate was actually not statistically different than other leads in the market, including our predecessor lead that was a fabulous lead. And so the challenge was, here you've got this lead that's not statistically any different. Yes, the failure mechanism's worse. What do? You have very few options in the United States with the FDA. If you want to stop selling and you want to take something off the shelf of the hospital, you must recall it. The word recall has connotations that are not very good, and we knew if we recalled it, we would have patients die because of the actions physicians took that weren't necessary, i.e. extracting the lead. You didn't need to extract the lead necessarily, and extraction is a very dangerous procedure. So it was this balancing act of do you, don't you, and ultimately we made the decision that we didn't want anybody else implanted with it until we knew for certain whether the lead was going to have a higher ultimate failure rate or not. And so we did the recall. I got lucky, sarcastically, because of all the guidant recalls that had been prior to Fidelis. The society had come out with a recommendation. Industry, when you do a recall, you should not just write to the physician, you need to write to the patient. So my name was on the letter to all the physicians and all the patients. When we did that recall, it was very visible. I got called in front of a congressional committee. I was called to the FDA to talk. We had done some very innovative ways to evaluate the lead. And everybody wanted to learn about that, and the FDA was trying to decide, is there a new way they should be monitoring leads because of what we'd done? I would say in the end, I had my integrity challenged by some folks. You should have done this earlier. I had a physician in my face at midnight at a conference. How dare you? And when you do what's right for patients, everything works out, and it worked out.
I think it's such an interesting story because you step into this new role in regulatory and quality, and this enormous challenge presents itself. You touched on it a little bit there, but what was it like personally for you managing that situation?
I have always believed, and Medtronic certainly is right there at the top of companies where it's all about the patient. And so I just brought all my heart and soul into trying to figure out what's the right thing. I can tell you, the investigation took, as I recall, about a year. And I learned a lot about ways to test leads on the bench and how to use CareLink to try to evaluate, is it failing, and can you predict it, and what can you do to prevent it, and can you give a warning to patients? And all along, it's, how can I make the best out of this situation for the people who have this lead? The last 2 or 3 weeks, we were, the senior leadership team, locked in a room with closed doors trying to make a decision. That was a little traumatic, I guess. But the day we did the recall, the stock dropped, I don't know, we lost billions of dollars of market cap. And Earl Bakken, who was the founder of Medtronic, called us that day. He was probably the single biggest loser of value that day, and thanked us for doing the right thing for patients. So you just put one foot in front of the other and try to do the right thing.
So from that role at Medtronic, you then move to a different role at Medtronic, and you start to sort of reinvent, reimagine their AF ablation unit. Take us through what that process was like.
Yeah, so in the 90s, AF ablation sort of became the darling for electrophysiology. And Medtronic and Guidant and St. Jude all were looking at the ablation space. Medtronic entered it through an acquisition. I won't bore you with the history. They exited it. And they exited it by handing it to St. Jude in 2002. St. Jude made hay with that. So prior to Medtronic giving up on AF, you really had 2 duopolies, a pacing duopoly and a defibrillator duopoly, Medtronic and St. Jude and Medtronic and Guidant. Medtronic hands St. Jude AF, and St. Jude now has its entry to defibrillators, and you end up with an oligopoly because now all three players have all the product lines. So march forward, Medtronic didn't take too long to realize that was not maybe the wisest move to make, and it was, okay, how do we get back into ablation when you've got St. Jude making hay with your former product and J&J, the #1 800-pound gorilla in the space. And so we looked every year and kept saying, Medtronic coming in as the third Me Too player does not sound like a very good strategy. Of course, I was living through Fidelis, so it was good timing. When Fidelis ended, I said, let me go figure out AF. And they let me go figure out AF. So we wanted to find a different approach and settled on, could we find a way, what we called, to democratize AF ablation, where every electrophysiologist could do the procedure instead of just the top-notch guys at the big institutions, and found two companies that had technologies with the promise to be able to be done by every electrophysiologist. And we bought them, and the rest is history.
Did you get any pushback on implementing this new model?
Oh, yeah. The pushback came externally and internally. The big thought leaders, the KOLs, thought it was the most stupid strategy we could ever have done, right? You need a big mapping system. You need a state-of-the-art focal RF catheter. What are you doing with this cryo balloon that anybody could plug the pulmonary veins with? And so you had to listen to the little docs, who said, I don't like ablation. I mean, I watched, come in my lab, you can see this isn't voodoo. And I'm like, it looks like voodoo to me when you're doing that pointer trying to isolate the pulmonary vein. And then internally, you got this massive sales force in cardiology calling on electrophysiologists. The electrophysiologists all want ablation. Please give me the product so I can sell it, actually, frankly, so I could give it away so I can sell more CRT or ICDs. And I just said, yeah, we've been through that. We got rid of the business once because that's the approach. We need a different approach. So there were internal and external struggles to bring the technology forward.
Yeah. So I think I really like these stories because I think they represent three sort of distinct roles and lessons, things that you've taken away from Medtronic. How did that time at Medtronic shape the way you lead Reva now?
Well, patients come first. If you think what you're doing is better for patients, whatever roadblock, whatever challenge comes in front of you, it's easy. It's just something to get over so that you can do what's right for patients. I was very fortunate with the AF business at Medtronic, Fidelis too, but the AF business to be able to say, if you bring a truly disruptive technology forward and you have some patients, because it does take patience to have a disruption really take hold, you can reap enormous benefit from what you can do for patients. And so it's pretty easy for me to stand up in front of the Reva team and talk about what we're doing and why we're doing it and why it's worth the struggles and all the fundraising and all the headaches that we're facing because of some of what's gone on in the industry, and to see everyone double down their commitment to try to bring this technology forward.
So what was your path to Reva? How did you get from Medtronic to Reva?
Yeah, so I mentioned that at Medtronic we acquired some companies to build AF. One of those was a company called CryoCath. And CryoCath was a publicly traded company in Montreal that was, bankrupt 2 or 3 times in its history, struggling to survive, sitting on this little gem, which today is a phenomenal success and led the disruption in the space. And when I had been running that for a period of time, I said, I'd like to do that again. And Reva as a company looked like CryoCath, and Reva's core technology, the polymer technology, TyraCore, has all of the capabilities that I thought the cryo balloon had to be a major disruption. So, you know, doing the cryo AF was just incredibly rewarding in the end, and I wanted to do the same thing, you know, in the different areas where I think the Tyrocore polymer can play.
Yeah, can you tell us a little bit about Reva's portfolio?
Sure. So as I mentioned, we have Tyrocore. We actually make the polymer in-house. It's a proprietary polymer. It has unique features. So it's bioresorbable. That's not unique. It is X-ray visible. So it's the only X-ray visible bioresorbable product in the market. It's a material that we can tweak so that it has characteristics tailored for the application. And it's strong. It allows us to do certain things with it, and it's very biocompatible. So our first product is a coronary, we call them scaffolds instead of stents. So drug-eluting coronary scaffold. Our second generation product called Phantom was CE marked in 2017 and launched. And our third generation now replacing Phantom is Phantom Encore. And we launched Phantom Encore in November. So we're in Europe and a few countries in Europe and Turkey. Our second product line is our CE marked product Motive for below the knee peripheral artery disease. And we're moving forward now with embolic beads, so bioresorbable X-ray visible embolic beads to treat bloodborne tumors, hypervascular tumors, wherever in the body.
Yeah, so for those of us that have been paying attention to what's going on in the interventional cardiology space in terms of bioresorbable stents and scaffolds, it's been a really interesting and newsworthy spot to pay attention to. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the challenges or opportunities that you see in that space?
Yeah, and I'll back up just a little bit and go back to CareLink, because then it'll help explain why I see the scaffold space the way I see it. So when we launched CareLink, CryoCath, as I mentioned, I had these challenges internally and externally with, give it to the big sales force, let us sell more cans. And I got very fortunate that the CEO at the time, Bill Hawkins, decided to pause and listen to both sides of the argument, and ultimately allowed me to have my own sales force. And so what I was able to do was to say, we don't want to sell this product to everybody. I'm going to price it at a premium, which will ensure, if you pay attention to the adoption curve, the innovators, early adopters, early majority, late majority laggards, those folks that are either late majority laggards or who are making a lot of money because of focal RF catheters, we don't want them to touch the cryo balloon. So you try to train the sales force, stay away from them, you price it at a premium so that they have an excuse not to use it. Why would I use that? It's not flexible, it only does pulmonary veins, and I can do anything with this focal catheter, and it's less expensive. Perfect, you keep thinking that. We're gonna go sell to the guys who hate that focal catheter because they might be in that lab for 8 hours and still not have a good procedure. And so Medtronic allowed us to bring the cryo balloon forward that way. So if you pivot now to the bioresorbable space, my view, and it's just my view, is that Abbott correctly saw that bioresorbable scaffolds are a major disruption to the coronary space that deserve to happen. It is the right thing for patients. But I think the mistake Abbott made was to believe that first mover advantage was what was important. It could have been true, except for the fact that the product that they had was not yet a prime time product. It's twice as thick as a metal stent. It's not as strong as a metal stent. They didn't know which patients it shouldn't be used in immediately. They didn't know proper implant technique. And so by believing first mover was the important thing, they either launched commercially or they launched a clinical study everywhere, right out of the gate. The rumors are they spent more than $1 billion on the Absorb program. Well, what happens when you move that fast is you get clinical results in a big way. when you have the wrong implant technique and some of the wrong patients, your clinical results aren't going to be very good. And so Abbott's results started to come out. Their 1-year results were okay, trending wrong. Their 2-year results inferior to metal. And so in September of 17, let's say 60 days after we launched in Europe, they withdrew the product from the market worldwide. So that's September of 17. In August of 18, the European Society of Cardiology, based only on the absorbed data, decides to update their guidelines, which include basically only use a bioresorbable scaffold if it's in a clinical study.
So when you're out there talking to clinicians, and there's all this news in the ether about bioresorbable scaffolds, and how do you get pushback from them? How do you fight that sort of the reputation?
Yeah, so two different things. First, I will say there is, I don't remember all the 7 or 9 stages of what you go through from anger to acceptance, all those stages, right? Everybody goes through those whenever there's a trauma in your life, right? I will say the big physicians who bought in to absorb being the be-all, end-all, greatest thing, they went through that cycle, okay? And so it's part of why the guidelines are as bad as they are. They wrote them while they were going through the early stages of that cycle, okay? And so they had to get through the cycle. They're on the other side of that cycle now, and there is some regret that the guidelines are written as they are. Now there's been at least one editorial that says, why did we classify all bioresorbable based on absorbed data? They're not all the same. They don't all use the same polymer and technology. So you have that piece going, and those physicians are coming around and paying more attention to what we're doing and looking at our data and now trying to figure out how to help us. As well as, I kind of use the democratization, the average interventional cardiologist, they believe. I mean, there was just recently the first 10-year results from metal stents. State-of-the-art metal stents, 10-year results, 3.3% adverse event rate every year through 10 years. The body doesn't like a foreign material in there forever. It doesn't need it, right? And so the average interventional cardiologist understands completely that bioresorbable, if we can get one that does as well as metal while it's there, it is going to beat metal when it's gone. And so they want it. Now the question is, can I get it through my hospital administration? Can I get it through my chief? Will the payer pay for it because of these guidelines? And so we have a series of headwinds that are certainly a challenge. The good news is we don't have a lot of competition.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of people in this room, and probably in the medical device industry in general, a big thing that they think about is how do I win over the hearts and minds of clinicians? What advice do you have for them on that? What's the primary strategy?
Well, in the macro sense, the important thing is what is the value of whatever the technology is. In this case, the value of bioresorbable is not the 1 or 2 year results. It's the get rid of the permanent metal implant, get rid of the long-term adverse event rates. So when you understand the value, then you go out and you talk to customers and figure out which ones believe in that value, right? And then you got to find your path to what's the right way with what level of evidence to expand the acceptance of the product, appropriately expand. You don't want to put it in patients it's not going to benefit, but what's the right way with the technology? Do I need to do more to make the technology better? And certainly we do. We're on our 3rd generation. Will there be a 4th? We'll see. But also for the physicians. And so in our case, for example, in the coronary, we launched earlier this year, our post-market study. We sort of knew the guidelines were going to be coming and we better have a study up and running. We will launch in 19 a randomized clinical trial in Europe because it is going to take randomized data to convince the naysayers to bring enough clinical evidence that says this product deserves its place on the shelf, deserves to be reimbursed. So you find the value proposition, you don't go too big, too broad, you got to have some pages. The cryo balloon, it's 2018. It launched in the US in 2010. We did the first major change to it in 2012. And there are just this year some of the largest institutions in the US beginning to use it. Disruption takes time.
Yeah, that's so interesting to me. And I think, the idea that Abbott sort of rushed the product and didn't allow for those, long-term study results to be published. But, there's always pressure, I think, for companies to sort of pump out innovation and get it to market as quickly as possible, especially if you identify a really important need. How do you strike that balance?
At the fundamental level, if you can recognize, is it disruptive or is it incremental? And if you can understand, is it, in that regard, is it replacing something that's really got a stronghold, right? Then you've got to be more careful with how you move. You got to have a little bit of luck. Senior management in the big companies got to be willing to be patient. As I said, Medtronic, for whatever reason, was with the AF business, and they're reaping the rewards today as a consequence. It's judgment.
So there's a lot going on in today's marketplace, a lot of things that I think the industry is paying attention to. What are you paying attention to?
Survival. In the coronary space, the only other player in the market in Europe today is Medtronic, and they are redesigning their product right now. So we're it. It is going to take time and money to get those guidelines turned around. And so, interacting with our shareholders and investors to make sure we have the time and money to be able to keep that technology moving forward and ultimately to prove its value is certainly priority number one. Priority number two is we got to do more faster somewhere else. So we've got, as I mentioned, the CE mark below the knee. So we're getting ready to do our first commercial work in 2019 with below the knee. It's a terrible disease to have with not very good treatment options. So it's another, potentially major improvement for patients. I mean, if you have a real peripheral artery disease below the knee, you have like a 25% chance of having an amputation within a year. I mean, it's really bad disease. So we're very excited. But again, we need to be careful. This is a new novel application for us. So, and we don't have $1 billion to throw at it anyway. So they're, bringing that, making sure we learn, making sure we do what's right for patients there. And then our embolics program, completely different, right? Because it's not a scaffold. It's beads that you're delivering through an interventional radiologist is going to deliver through the artery to block the blood supply to that tumor. And bland beads without drugs are, a much more straightforward regulatory path, 510K in the US. And then what we're doing, figuring out how to put drugs on, all potentially very game-changing capabilities. And we're the only X-ray visible bioresorbable bead potential. If you have BPH or you have uterine fibroids, I think you want to know that the beads went where they're supposed to go. So you would want to be able to see them. And you should have a very nice long life expectancy, so you don't want that foreign body in there, so you want it to bioresorb. It's a great application of our Tyrocore polymer. So trying to keep a very small team, and we are a very small team, doing 3 different product lines, creating the clinical evidence, trying to find the investors that are willing to fund us, to be able to prove in each of these areas that we actually have, what is the right technologies for patients. That keeps me busy.
Yeah, I would imagine so. So, you just mentioned raising funds. What sort of advice do you have for the companies that are seeking funds?
Go get more money than you think you'll ever need as fast as you can go get it. When a company gets started, and you're in the early stages, and you've got some shtick, and somebody believes in you and is willing to put the first money in. What I've found is that investors like to follow investors. There's a bit of a crowd mentality. And so that's what I mean by go get more than you think you'll ever need, because once you've got the first one willing to put some money in, everybody else will be there, put more money in. So that's point one. Point two, you're probably going to fail. There are very few technologies that the first iteration is going to be a home run. You might get lucky and sell the company fast enough that you don't have to live with having to fix it. Bought some of those. But the odds are you're going to fail. So be prepared for it isn't going to work the first time out of the gate. Don't drink your own Kool-Aid about how perfect you are and how perfect the technology is and how it's going to change the world in 60 days. Be ready, right? And I look at Reva. We have 3 different product lines now. I kind of wish we'd had 3 different product lines 3 years ago, right? I'd be in a different fundraising boat right now. So be prepared for that. And I spend a lot of time when I'm not raising money talking to potential sources of money, because it takes people hearing a story many times before they're really ready for you to knock on the door and ask for money.
Yeah. You mentioned that people should prepare themselves for failure. You will experience failure throughout your career. It's inevitable. What are some of your strategies for effectively managing failure?
Oh, there's so many contexts to that question. There's the personal, right? My father got fired when he was, I don't remember now, 50-something years old. He said, get fired in your 20s, right? You're gonna personally fail. Do it earlier, right? The earlier you do it, the less it hurts. So if you haven't failed yet and you're not in your 20s, I hope you don't experience it, but realize that if you look left and you look right, everybody's pretty much had something happen. And you gotta not take it personally. I mean, it just happens. Sometimes you do something wrong. Sometimes bad things happen around you. Sometimes you have the wrong boss. It can be, it can come from anywhere. Life's a journey, not a destination. Make sure you're having fun along the way. And when you hit those roadblocks, you just pick it up and turn and move another direction. From a company perspective, it's kind of the same thing, except that you got the employees, right? And so when a company fails, I mean, I feel very badly. Amaranth was sort of the up-and-comer in the bioresorbable space talked about, and it's gone. It's gone, right? And it's gone because Absorb failed, and they couldn't find an investor to come in. You try to do your best as a CEO, right? You try to do your best for the employees and be as honest and as helpful as you can be. I mean, we just did another round of layoffs at Reva 3 or 4 weeks ago, and I'm writing letters of recommendation for the employees, trying to make sure everybody lands on their feet. Again, it's kind of back to if you do what's right for patients, if you do what's right for people, it'll work out.
Yeah. On a slightly different note, you've had experience launching products in the US, you've had experience launching products in Europe. It seems to me that in the last maybe decade or so, there's been a really interesting shift in terms of the regulatory landscape in both areas. Have you noticed any shifts in the way that you launch a product?
Yeah, so the old adage, everybody goes to Europe first because the regulatory barrier is way down here. And you come to the US last because the regulatory barrier is way up here. I'll do a little plug for anybody that in this room wants to listen, because I completely disagree with how we view the regulatory process in Europe versus the US. And this notion that they approve stuff too fast in Europe, and we can all cite examples of products that got approved in Europe that ultimately got withdrawn, okay? Because Europe historically only tested safety, not efficacy, was the theory of how the regulatory hurdle is in Europe. What no one ever quantifies is how long a patient benefited in Europe because of earlier access than a patient in the US that didn't get that early access. And if anybody in here is ever going to do the math to say that we should have stricter regulations in Europe because things get approved too fast, please do both sides of the story. It's my plug. But it is changing in Europe because people don't do the balancing act here. They just focus on the negatives. Europe is getting harder, and there's this new MDR regulation. People are saying in the coronary scaffold space that the next product that will be approved will probably have to have the endpoint of their trial after bioresorption. Okay? So we got Phantom approved on a 6-month endpoint in 120 patients. For us to do past resorption would have been a 4+ year endpoint to that trial. Okay? Even the FDA doesn't require that. So we're seeing a dramatic change in Europe where they're going to raise the bar. How far up that bar is going to go, I think is still a TBD, at least, for example, in coronary arteries. With the FDA, it swings with the emotions of the United States. Either the FDA is too harsh, and I got to fly to Europe because I can't get access, and then the FDA gets pressure to move faster, or the FDA is too lax, and this awful Fidelis lead got approved and got into 180,000 people and should never have been approved, and you should have had a trial that was 4 years long or 5 years long. And the FDA swings depending on what's in the newspaper.
Yeah. You've touched on this already, but can you tell us a little bit about what's ahead for Reva?
Well, hopefully what's ahead for Reva is in the coronary space, it's probably going to take us 3 to 5 years to be able to drive the society guidelines from class 3 to class 2C, class 2B to 1C to 1A. And so we've got that march ahead of us. And then figuring out from a fundraising standpoint and a clinical evidence standpoint, when do you go to the US or somewhere else other than CE mark countries? We will in 19 do our first commercial below the knee. Depending on how well that product performs, it'll either launch more broadly in 19, or maybe we'll have to do some tweaking to it, maybe the drug delivery. So that product is sort of anywhere from a 12-month to couple of year outlook here before its real value proposition is known and its commercial path clear. Embolics, we ought to be in the US within a couple of years with bland beads, hopefully make great progress with putting drug on the beads, and that'll be a PMA, so that takes longer, but then you have a proprietary product and more value. And meanwhile, raising enough money to be able to do it all.
Does anybody have any questions for Reggie? We can run a mic around to you. We're getting a mic to you.
Okay. 2 questions for now. You mentioned that you have no competition, and that is a good thing. Can you tell me why it's a good thing and not a bad thing?
Yeah, so it's good and bad, to be completely fair. What's good about it is once we have the clinical evidence that is convincing, you're going to use our product. So our revenue opportunity is much larger. Whereas had Abbott been successful with Absorb, there were 10 or 15 other Me Too Absorbs that all would have flooded the European market. Pricing would have gone down. Our share, even with a better product, which I believe we have, maybe we'd have been a 20 or 30% share position instead of a 100% share position. Maybe it'd have been 20% of a larger market, which is the advantage of having, for example, an Abbott out there, in front of you because you can draft. But being the only one, you get 100% of potentially a smaller pie.
To me, it looks like that having a competition makes you a better company, that you can invent better. Don't just look at the market, at the money. Look what you can do to improve life of human. Money comes second or third. Competition makes you stronger. Working with other companies, the more competition you have, the more better you can be in technology part, and also the better you can be on serve the humanity, and then along the way, without you realizing it, the more beneficial you become, the more money you make in the long run. Don't think a short vision. Don't put a blind in front of your eye. Think long vision, but don't overlook small steps that takes you there. That is my opinion. Second question I have is that you say that you go to Europe because US takes longer. Would you explain so we understand, is it takes longer due to the bureaucracies that the United States wastes time on the nonsense things and not really what this technology can do to human life and how can improve and save lives instead of who pays for it? Forget who pays, somebody will pay. But don't make it expensive to the patient. That patient is not able, even the technology is there, patient is not able to buy it. And even technology is there, patient will die because he cannot afford. You have to, medical industry and have to really, really focus on making life of the patient the most valuable asset, because that is all that we have, the most valuable asset. Money comes and goes, companies come and go. The life is one-time deal. So my question is, do we have to focus more on US government to look at, not at the money, not at the nonsense bureaucracy, but on what this technology can do to human life? What you say that?
Yeah, so again, my view, in the United States, what we have asked from the FDA is that they have a reasonable confidence and proof that a product is both safe and effective, okay? In the space of coronary artery disease stents or scaffolds, in order to determine that safety efficacy bar, it is a 1,500 to 2,000 patient trial with a 12-month endpoint, follow the patients for 5 years. That trial for us is going to cost about $60 million. Okay, so even if I have the best product in the whole wide world for these patients, I got to have $60 million just to do the trial. Forget the cost to invent the technology, forget the cost to make it, I got to have $60 million to run the trial, okay? That's a cultural decision. In Europe, I did 120 patients in 6 months. I don't know what that trial cost. It was single arm, so that trial was probably less than, I don't know, $10 million, right? it's a different cultural view of bringing technology forward to patients. It isn't a bureaucracy question in my view, although there certainly is some of that, but it's much more a fundamental, what is the level of proof that you want before you're going to allow a company to sell a product in the United States?
We've got another question.
Okay.
Thank you for sharing your story. It was very compelling. I'm going to ask a question more on a personal level. Can you comment on any mentors or managers or naysayers who have been instrumental in your life, and are you also being able to pay it forward with others? I'm not asking as a gender question, but just as young engineers or young business people, how can you overcome people who are negative or who don't want to take a chance and maybe compliment those who were helpful?
Yeah, I will tell you, do as I say and don't do as I did. Networking is about the most important thing you can do in a career. And finding people who both can see you through a more honest light than you're going to see yourself, but who are kind about it. For a female, finding a male who can help you understand all those people who are typically above you in a big company that aren't female, but can be true for an engineer. You know, yes, you might find engineers, but find non-engineers. How are engineers viewed? What are the positives and negatives? Make sure that you are reaching out and networking to folks who can help your career, whether it's within your company, peers, whether it's seniors. I didn't do that. I thought, if I do my job well, I'll be noticed. Don't believe that. That's just not true. You got to speak up. I remember one time I was in a smaller company, and I went to my boss, and I said, I think all my male peers are making more money than I'm getting. Very unfemale thing to do. And I got a $100,000 raise. Oh, gee, do you think I was making less money? So networking, I would say, is the number one thing that I would recommend. I would also say be a little patient in your career, particularly for younger folks. I was quick to leave a job the minute I didn't like it, or the minute I had a boss I didn't like. You learn more in the more difficult settings. I mean, I couldn't have lived through Fidelis if I was not going to put up with trauma. Be patient about that. But also, it's helpful to go where the crowd isn't. So, I mean, people, when I took the quality regulatory position at Medtronic, everybody thought I was leaving. Why would you take a quality regulatory position? Right? You'd been a vice president, general manager, right? You know, I remember advising a peer of mine, take the Brady job, not the CRT job. CRT is on a run rate to be $1 billion within the first 12 months of launch. Do you think you can keep it at that rate in year 2? Not a chance. You have only down to go. Brady is losing money every year. Down, down, down. If you keep going down, is anybody going to tell you you did a bad job? No. If you can just do that with it, you're a hero. Go to Brady. So be patient both with difficult jobs, difficult bosses. Look for roads less traveled because you'll learn more. Am I paying it forward? I try. Life is an interesting thing. I have a 94-year-old mother who lives with me and is dependent on me in Minnesota. I have a 22-year-old son who has got his own little struggles in life living with me, and I work in San Diego. So I don't do as much mentoring right now as I otherwise would, but I'm meeting somebody at 1 o'clock today to do it, so I do try. But I don't sign up for very many group, please be a mentor on this list of, they can call you. I don't do that right now.
So great comments and great coaching, really appreciate it. I'm a marketing leader in the med device startup world. And one of the things that I often comment on at seminars or presentations is that startup companies need to consider bringing in their commercialization team sooner rather than later. And that is important because the core teams are typically technology people, very, very bright. But when you start talking to them about pricing strategy, segmentation, the approach to messaging, et cetera, you get the blank eye. So my thought is that commercialization teams should be on or at the time of proof of concept, or even earlier, but no later than that. What are your thoughts? What do you think about that? I'm coaching quite a bit at the UCI Center for Innovation, as well as other startup companies that I'm talking to, and I say to them, you need to get your commercialization team in, especially if you're lucky to get an early approval and your investors are saying to you, why aren't you selling? You say, well, they don't have fulfillment, they don't have distribution, that kind of thing. Comment on where that should be inserted?
Yeah, so there is no question that both the marketing strategy side as well as the manufacturing ops side change dramatically when you're going commercial. Reva, I was brought in as the CEO when our clinical trial in Europe was, I brought in 2015. We had CE mark in 2017, so 2 years before. And I was brought in to be the commercial lead. That's what they were looking for. Probably they should have done it earlier, before maybe even the clinical trial was designed. Now, should I have hired a marketing team and a scale-up manufacturing team that early? There are certainly benefits, but there's also, at some point, some boredom that can occur if the product is delayed. So there's trade-offs. You definitely need somebody in-house early who has some commercial capability.
And when you say early, if you take a look at a typical stage and gate process where you go from ideation to, pilot assembly and then et cetera, where in there, do you see it in no later than maybe step 2 of let's say a 5-gate process? I'm just trying to get a feel for when you say the word early, I try to define it down to a little more granular if I can. Just curious to know.
Yeah, it's hard to exactly answer. I'll use Reva as an example of when there were choices, right? Reva had a first-generation bioresorbable scaffold that failed in 2014. So it was in clinical trial. They believed with all their heart it was going to be a great product. They put it in clinical trial, followed patients, and it failed. And there was a complete reset of the company in 2014. So had the company hired commercial, well, in fact, they actually had a head of sales in Europe at the time. They had to let all that go, right? So the risk you take is you have resets like that and you let people go as a consequence. I still think that we on average wait too long to bring commercial leadership on board. I would have it as early as you can get it, even from the day you invent the idea. You got your first prototype, having the capable commercial skill. Now, that doesn't mean you need a 5-person marketing team, right? But you need some commercial capability.
Thanks a lot. I think at the very minimum, 1, if typically the teams I work with are 3 to 5 people, no marketing, no significant strategic planning. I'll just close by saying I appreciate that because I think that the sooner the better, especially your investors are sitting on the edge of their seats waiting for an approval and then they turn to you and say, why aren't you selling? So thank you very much.
Any other questions for Reggie? All right. How about a hand for Reggie Groves, everybody?
Thank you.